Picture this. You're a German pensioner. You've worked your whole life. You've been prudent. You don't gamble. You don't chase trends. You invest in solid blue-chip companies listed on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. Safe bets. Government-regulated bets. In 2018, you notice a company called Wirecard climbing the DAX index. It's a fintech company, digital payments, the future of money. It's German, it's trustworthy, it's been audited by Ernst Young, one of the big four accounting firms. So you invest your retirement savings, you buy the stock. You feel smart, you feel secure, you tell your friends about it. 3 years later, that stock is worth nothing. Your life savings have evaporated into thin air. And you discover something that makes your blood run cold. The company never actually had any money at all, not a single euro. Not in any real bank account, not anywhere. The whole thing was an elaborate fiction created on spreadsheets and in the minds of two men who wanted to build the next Apple, the next Google, the next tech titan. Except they didn't build anything, they just wrote numbers into computers. This is the story of Wirecard, the greatest financial fraud in modern German history. A scandal so audacious that when it finally collapsed, it didn't just destroy a company, it destroyed faith in the entire system that was supposed to protect people from exactly this kind of thing. It destroyed faith in auditors, faith in regulators, faith in the idea that if something is listed on a major stock exchange, it must be legitimate. But before we get to the collapse, we need to understand how this fraud even became possible. We need to go back to where it started. We need to understand the mentality that allowed two men to convince the entire financial world that they were geniuses, when in reality they were just criminals with better PowerPoint presentations. It processed payments for the internet's less respectable corners, gambling websites, pornography sites, online casinos, the dirty money of the digital world. These were the clients that mainstream banks wouldn't touch. They wouldn't work with them. They wouldn't process their payments. They considered them too risky, too morally questionable, too legally complicated. But Wirecard had no shame about it. Or rather, it had no choice. Nobody else wanted this business. So Wirecard took it. They built their entire foundation on processing payments for people nobody else wanted to work with. For years, Wirecard was anonymous, invisible, just another small payments processor in a crowded field. It made money, but not much. The margins were thin. The competition was fierce. The business model was fundamentally boring and low-tech. Move money from point A to point B, take a cut, repeat, again and again and again. This is what the company actually was. This is what would remain true no matter what else happened. Wirecard was a payment processor for disreputable businesses. They didn't invent anything. They didn't create new technology. They moved money. That was it. But then, in 2002, a man named Markus Braun became CEO. This is where everything changes. This is where the fraud begins. Not with the first fake document, not with the first forged bank statement, but with a dream, a vision, an ambition. Markus Braun was not a typical corporate executive. He modeled himself after Steve Jobs. Black turtlenecks, rimless glasses, an aura of intellectual superiority. Cold, calculated. Obsessed with legacy and power. He had a vision that burned in him like a fire. Wirecard wasn't going to stay a small payments processor. It was going to become something massive, something revolutionary. It was going to become Germany's answer to Silicon Valley. It was going to be Germany's answer to Apple. Germany's answer to Google. He wanted to build a tech giant, not just a profitable company, not just a successful business, a tech giant. A company whose name would be synonymous with innovation. A company that would make German industry proud. A company that would prove Germany could produce the kind of transformative technology that Americans took for granted. This wasn't a business plan. This was a psychological need. Markus Braun wanted to be remembered as a visionary. He wanted to be legendary. He wanted to be Steve Jobs. He wanted to walk into rooms and have people recognize him. He wanted to change the world. The problem was that the actual business couldn't support that vision. The payment processing business was profitable, but it wasn't that profitable. It was a 15 to 20% margin business. Comfortable. Boring, profitable. But it wasn't explosive growth profitable. It wasn't venture capital, billion-dollar valuation profitable. It wasn't the kind of business that would justify a company being valued at tens of billions of euros. Markus Braun didn't want to be boring. He wanted to be legendary. And he was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen, so he did something audacious. In 2005, Wirecard listed on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. But here's the twist, and this is crucial. They didn't do a traditional IPO. They didn't go through the normal process of taking the company public, where investment banks scrutinize your business model, where analysts grill your management, where regulators conduct intensive review. That would have taken too long. That would have exposed the reality of the business. That would have prevented the dream from happening. Instead, Wirecard bought a defunct call center company and used it as a shell, a backdoor listing. It was a way to bypass the intense scrutiny that comes with a normal IPO process. They avoided having to justify their business model to skeptical investment banks. They avoided having analysts pick apart their financials. They just appeared on the exchange, like magic, fully formed. A company with legitimacy, a company with a ticker symbol, a company that existed in the DAX. The stock began to rise. Investors loved the story. A fintech company, digital payments, the future of money. Wirecard started winning contracts with major companies. They expanded internationally. They acquired other companies. They opened offices in Singapore and Dubai and Manila. By 2018, just 13 years after listing on the exchange through a backdoor process, Wirecard was worth 24 billion euros. 24 billion, that's not a typo, not a rounding error. 24,000 million euros. To put that in perspective, Wirecard was now worth more than Commerzbank. Commerzbank was a historic German institution. It had existed for over a century. It had survived wars and economic collapses and multiple financial crises. Wirecard had been around for 20 years and mostly processed payments for gambling websites. Yet Wirecard was now more valuable, much more valuable. The company had replaced Commerzbank in the DAX 30 index. A company in the DAX is supposed to be one of the most legitimate, most scrutinized, most trusted companies in the country. Wirecard was now sitting at that table. If you looked at the stock price, it was undeniable. Growth that looked almost impossible. Growth that looked like the growth of Apple in its early days. Growth that looked like the growth of Google when it first went public. This wasn't just a successful company, this was a transcendent company. This was the future. But here's what nobody knew. Here's the thing that would eventually destroy everything. The growth wasn't real. It was an illusion, a sophisticated, elaborate, mathematically precise illusion, but an illusion nonetheless. Traded on Germany's premier stock exchange, held in the portfolios of thousands of pension funds, retail investors, and mutual funds. Millions of people had their retirement savings tied up in this company. And the entire valuation was based on revenues and profits that never actually happened. They were pure fiction. The fraud worked like this. Wirecard's core business was real. They actually processed payments for gambling and porn sites. That was real. They actually had contracts with merchants. That was real. But margins on that business were thin, maybe 15 to 20%. Not enough to justify a 24 billion euro valuation. Not even close. Not by a factor of 100 or more. So they invented something new. They called it the third-party acquirer model. The idea sounded legitimate on paper. It sounded like a genius business strategy. Wirecard would partner with large companies in Asia, Dubai, Singapore, the Philippines, who would handle acquiring merchants and processing payments locally. These partners would then send commission payments back to Wirecard's headquarters in Munich. It was a partnership model. Perfectly reasonable business strategy. Companies do this all the time, except the partners weren't real, or rather, they were barely real. They existed as shell companies, empty offices with a few employees. Companies with official names and bank accounts and paperwork, but no actual business operations. Yet on Wirecard's financial statements, These phantom partners were responsible for 50% of total revenue. One major partner was called Al-Alam, located in Dubai. On paper, Al-Alam was processing billions of dollars in transactions annually. Billions. Billions with a capital B, transactions flowing through their system every second. According to Wirecard's financial reports, Al-Alam was one of the largest payment processors in the Middle East. But if you actually visited Al-Alam's office, you'd find a small space with a handful of employees. Maybe 5 people, maybe 10. Just a small office that looked like any small office anywhere. Nothing that suggested they were processing billions of dollars. Nothing that suggested they were major partners of a €24 billion company. In fact, if you'd asked the employees of Al-Alam what they did, some of them would have been confused. They would have told you they had no idea what Wirecard was even talking about. The fraud needed one more layer. Just ones and zeros in a computer. Investors and auditors need to see money, actual money, physical currency, in actual bank accounts, or at least confirmation from legitimate banks that the money exists. This is where the second genius of the fraud revealed itself. And I want to emphasize genius here, not in the sense of admiration, but in the sense of understanding the sophistication of the deception. Too easy for auditors to call up Deutsche Bank or Commerzbank and say, "Does Wirecard have an account with you? How much money is in it?" Banks would confirm or deny. The lie would be instantly exposed. So they moved it offshore. They claimed that Wirecard had massive trust accounts in 2 Manila banks, 2 legitimate banks in the Philippines, BDO Unibank and Bank of the Philippine Islands. These weren't normal operating accounts. They were special accounts, trust accounts, the kind of accounts that serious international companies have, the kind of accounts that hold money from sophisticated international transactions. Supposedly, these accounts were holding nearly €2 billion in cash. €2 billion. Legitimate profits from legitimate operations with legitimate partners. Except none of it was legitimate. All of it was fake. The documents confirming this were, essentially, forged. Not by sophisticated criminals with printing presses and watermarking equipment. Not by people with years of experience in document forgery, but by a junior employee on a laptop in Germany. A kid. Basically. PDF documents with pasted signatures of bank employees, signatures that the junior employee found online, or maybe just drew crudely, letterhead that was copied from the bank's official websites, forms that were constructed from scratch, crude, obvious. If anyone actually looked closely, but nobody did. Because here's the thing about big lies. They survive not because they're well hidden, but because people don't want to believe them. They survive because they're so big that they seem impossible. They survive because they align with what people already believe to be true. Wirecard was a DAX company. It was audited by Ernst Young, one of the big 4 accounting firms in the world. It was regulated by BaFin, the German financial regulator. It had the imprimatur of legitimacy. It had official approval stamps. So when documents arrived saying the money was in Philippine banks, most people didn't verify them. They didn't call the banks directly. They didn't send someone to Manila to look at the bank accounts in person. They assumed the auditors had done that job. They assumed the financial professionals had verified the documents. They assumed the regulators were watching. They assumed the system worked. And that assumption was their undoing. But in 2015, someone started asking questions. A journalist at the Financial Times named Dan McCrum. Dan was investigating payment processors. He was looking at the business model. He was looking at the numbers, looking at the revenue, looking at the growth. And something didn't add up. The growth was too fast. The margins were too high. The business model was too opaque. Why couldn't anyone find information about these partners? Why couldn't anyone verify who Al-Alam actually was? Why did a small company in Dubai supposedly process more transactions than PayPal's entire Asia division? The numbers didn't make sense. They didn't add up. Dan McCrum started writing. He started publishing stories. Long, detailed investigations called The House of Wirecard. It alleged accounting inconsistencies. It highlighted the opacity of the third-party acquirer business. It pointed out that these partners were barely visible, barely traceable, barely real. His reporting was meticulous. It was sourced. It was accurate. It was also completely ineffective. Why? Because when journalists expose fraud, the normal response is that regulators investigate. Regulators look at the evidence. Regulators do their job. Not in this case. Not with Wirecard. The German financial regulator BaFin did investigate, but they investigated the journalist, not the company. They looked into whether Dan McCrum was engaged in market manipulation, whether he was short-selling Wirecard stock and fabricating stories to drive the price down, whether he was using false information to profit from the company's decline. They did not investigate Wirecard. The regulator that was supposed to protect investors, that was supposed to enforce financial regulations, that was supposed to police fraud. Instead of investigating the company that was potentially committing fraud, they investigated the journalist who was exposing it. They banned short-selling of Wirecard stock. If you wanted to bet that Wirecard would decline, you couldn't. The regulator wouldn't allow it. They protected the company from people who thought it was fraudulent. They protected the lie. Imagine that. The incentives are completely backwards. The company being accused of fraud gets protected by the regulator. The journalist doing the investigating gets interrogated. The people trying to uncover the truth get suppressed. The people perpetrating the fraud get defended. This is what regulatory capture looks like. This is what happens when the regulator is more interested in protecting the financial system's image than in protecting investors. When the regulator is more interested in avoiding scandal than in exposing fraud. When the regulator is so captured by the industry, it's supposed to regulate that it literally investigates the people trying to stop fraud, instead of investigating the fraud itself. In Singapore, where Wirecard had an office, and supposedly one of the major third-party acquirer partnerships, something was happening that should have triggered alarm bells immediately. A senior legal counsel named Pav Gill worked for Wirecard. He was in charge of compliance. His job was to make sure everything was above board. His job was to make sure that the company was following regulations. His job was to catch fraud before it became a scandal. What Pav discovered was something called round-tripping. Money flowing from Wirecard to a third party, then immediately flowing back to Wirecard, but classified differently on the books. So it looked like new revenue from a partner. In reality, it was just money recycling itself. The same money moving in a circle. An accounting trick so obvious that it should have been caught immediately. A child could see through it. Pav tried to report it internally. He tried to escalate concerns through proper channels. He tried to do his job. He tried to stop the fraud from inside the company. And what happened next changed his life forever. Changed him fundamentally as a person. He was bullied. His reputation was attacked. He was followed by private investigators. Not in a paranoid way, actually followed. To send a message. When he continued to push for answers, when he refused to go away quietly, he was forced out. His career at Wirecard ended. His professional reputation was damaged. He was blacklisted from the industry. This is what happened to the whistleblower. This is the cost of trying to stop fraud from inside. But here's the thing about whistleblowers. They often have people in their lives who believe in them, who push them to do the right thing even when it's terrifying, who remind them that standing up to fraud matters. She told him something simple but profound. She said, "You cannot let them win, you have to do the right thing." It's such a simple statement, but it's also profound. You cannot let them win. As if all that remains is whether you, as an individual, will contribute to that corruption or resist it. Your mother. Your mother. He gave them the proof of the scheme. He gave them the ammunition they needed to tell the story publicly. Dan McCrum published the story. And again, nothing happened. Wirecard hired lawyers. They issued denials. They questioned the journalist's credibility. They suggested he was pushing a personal agenda. The stock price kept climbing. Because the lie was too big, too official, too well protected by people with vested interests in its truth, too profitable for too many people. Think about that. He's supported by a whistleblower. He has documents, he has evidence, and nothing happens. The regulator investigates him instead of the company. The company's stock continues to rise. The lie continues to work. Now, let me tell you what happened next, because this is where the fraud becomes almost absurd in its sophistication, almost cartoonishly evil, almost impossible to believe. Except it happened. All of it happened. Under pressure from Dan McCrum's reporting and questions from investors, Wirecard's leadership decided to do something brilliant, diabolically brilliant. They would hire an independent auditor to clear their name. They would commission a special investigation by KPMG, the world's biggest consulting firm. KPMG would examine the books. KPMG would verify the cash in the Philippines. KPMG would prove that everything was legitimate. KPMG would silence the critics. It was genius. It was brilliant. Because if KPMG cleared them, then the story would be over. The debate would be settled. Wirecard would go back to being a respected company with nothing to hide, and Markus Braun would get to continue being the visionary CEO. The German tech titan. KPMG accepted the engagement. They had millions of reasons to accept. Consulting fees. The prestige of working with a major DAX company. They conducted their investigation. They examined the documents. They looked at the financial statements. They released their report on April 28, 2020, and here's where it gets interesting. The KPMG report did not clear Wirecard, not even close. Instead, KPMG said something that should have been absolutely devastating. They said they could not verify the existence of €1 billion in profits that Wirecard claimed to have earned between 2016 and 2018. €1 billion. Gone. Unverifiable. Impossible to confirm. Just gone. That's the finding of the world's biggest consulting firm after a major investigation. €1 billion missing, or non-existent. Same difference. For a moment, just one moment, the lie wobbled. The house of cards trembled. The structure that had been so carefully constructed over years began to creak. €1 billion couldn't be verified. The banks in the Philippines couldn't be found. The money didn't exist. But then Wirecard's leadership did what they'd always done. They spun, they reframed, they explained. They said KPMG's inability to find the money wasn't evidence that it didn't exist. It was evidence that the money was hidden in sophisticated offshore accounts, secret accounts, protected accounts, accounts that were intentionally opaque for business reasons. The money was real, they insisted. It was just hidden somewhere that even KPMG's experts couldn't find it. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, in denying reality, in reframing bad news as just a different kind of good news. Yes, KPMG couldn't find it, but that's because it was so well hidden. That's because they were so sophisticated in their offshore operations. The stock price, surprisingly, started to recover slightly. Wirecard issued a statement saying KPMG's investigation should have definitively cleared them. The psychological power of simply denying bad news is underestimated. People wanted to believe Wirecard. People had invested their retirement savings in Wirecard. People had built their identities around supporting Wirecard. So when the company said, "Don't worry, KPMG actually found nothing wrong," people believed it, or wanted to believe it. Same thing, effectively. Then came June 18, 2020. This is what the scandal would later call D-Day. They told Wirecard they couldn't approve the 2019 accounts. They couldn't sign off on the financial statements. They couldn't put their names and their reputation on a document that contained lies. The reason was simple and devastating. The company had admitted that €1.9 billion was missing, not hidden, not in offshore accounts, missing, just gone, nowhere to be found. The auditors explained what they'd done. They'd actually called the banks in the Philippines. Finally, after years of accepting document confirmations, they'd actually made the phone calls. Not through Wirecard's representatives, not through intermediaries. They'd called the banks directly, BDO Unibank, Bank of the Philippine Islands. They'd asked about Wirecard's trust accounts, and the banks had responded with a single sentence that broke the entire fraud wide open. Wirecard is not a client of this bank. The document you're referring to is a falsified document and carries forged signatures. One sentence. Everything collapsed. Every assumption fell apart. Every bit of legitimacy evaporated. One sentence from a bank in Manila. One sentence spoken by someone on a phone call. One sentence admitting that they'd never heard of Wirecard, that they'd never processed their transactions, that they'd never held their money. Everything was fake. He issued a statement saying he was stepping down while the company investigated the discrepancies. He expressed shock and disappointment. He claimed he'd been misled by his subordinates. He said he was a victim too. He said he looked forward to clearing his name. Jan Marsalek, his COO and partner in the fraud, was suspended. Hours later, Jan Marsalek did something remarkable, something that would define the rest of his life. He texted a colleague. His message was simple and revealing. "Please do not call me anymore." Then he vanished. What happened next was like a scene from a spy thriller, from a Cold War movie, from a story about defection. Marsalek allegedly took a private jet from Vienna. His destination was Minsk, Belarus. From there, reports suggest he made his way to Moscow. For weeks, nobody knew where he was. His family issued statements saying they'd lost contact with him. His lawyers issued statements saying they didn't know his whereabouts. But Jan Marsalek had simply disappeared from the Western world. He left behind his company, his reputation, his future in Europe, everything. He just left. Years later, intelligence reports would surface suggesting that Marsalek had made his way to Russia, that he was living under FSB protection, that he had a new identity, that his passport was forged and documented him as a priest, that he was living in a luxury compound somewhere in Moscow, allegedly paid for by Russian intelligence. The man who orchestrated billions of dollars in fraud had essentially defected to Russia like it was the Cold War. Think about that. The mastermind of one of the biggest frauds in financial history. Living in Moscow, protected by the Russian state, with a fake identity. Not in hiding, because intelligence reports suggest he's living openly, just not as Jan Marsalek. He went to ground and disappeared into a different country entirely. But I'm getting ahead of the story. Let me back up to June 25, 2020. Wirecard filed for insolvency. The revenues were gone. The profits were gone. The whole thing was gone. It was the first company in DAX history to go completely bust. DAX companies are supposed to be blue chips. They're supposed to be stable. They're supposed to be long-term investments. They're not supposed to collapse overnight into absolute nothing. But Wirecard did. The stock that had been trading above €100 per share dropped to pennies. €100 per share became €80 per share. Then 50, then 30, then 10, then 1. Then fractions of cents. Within a week, it had lost 99% of its value. 99%. Nearly complete wipeout. People who'd had life savings in Wirecard went from millionaires to bankrupt overnight. Pensioners who'd bought the stock as a safe investment lost everything. Employees who'd had stock options as part of their compensation suddenly owned nothing. Nothing. All of it evaporated. All of it gone. Thousands of German retail investors, people who'd done everything right, who'd invested carefully in what they thought was a legitimate DAX company, had been destroyed financially. Their only mistake was trusting the system, trusting that if a company was listed on Germany's premier stock exchange, it must be legitimate, trusting that if it was audited by one of the world's largest accounting firms, it must be safe, trusting that if it was regulated by government authorities, it must be supervised. Their only mistake was trusting. The system failed them, spectacularly, completely, totally. An elderly woman in Berlin had invested her entire pension, her entire life's savings. She'd worked for 50 years, she'd been careful, she'd saved. And then in 1 week, it was gone. All of it. She would have to work longer. She would have to live differently. She would have to downsize her life. Because 2 men wanted to be legendary. Because 2 men wanted to build the next Apple. Because 2 men valued their legacy more than they valued the lives of ordinary people. Now, you might be wondering, How did they actually fake 2 billion euros? How did they create forged documents that passed scrutiny by major accounting firms? How did they maintain the lie for so long? The answer is both simpler and more disturbing than you might think. A junior employee in Wirecard's Munich headquarters was tasked with creating bank confirmations from the Philippine banks, documents that would prove the money existed. He didn't use sophisticated counterfeiting equipment. He didn't have years of experience in document forgery. He used a laptop, Microsoft Word. He had access to the internet. He took legitimate letterheads from the bank's websites. He pasted in signatures he found online. Maybe he drew some signatures crudely himself. He created PDF documents that were, frankly, crude. If anyone had looked closely, they would have noticed obvious errors. Signatures that didn't match signatures from other documents, the wrong bank employee names, people who didn't actually work in the relevant departments, formatting inconsistencies, fonts that didn't match the bank's official documents. Obvious tells that something was wrong, but the documents were never scrutinized by someone who actually knew what they were looking at. When auditors received these confirmations, they typically didn't go back to the banks independently. They didn't have a process for verification. They assumed the documents were real. It was part of their due diligence process. If a document looks official, it's probably real. The auditor from Ernst Young never called BDO Unibank directly until June 2020. Years of audits. Years of confirming that billions of euros existed in Philippine banks. Years of signing off on financial statements that contained these forged documents. Years. These are some of the most reputable accountants in the world. Ernst Young audits massive multinational corporations. They audit banks. They audit governments. They're supposed to be the gold standard of financial verification. They're supposed to be the professionals who catch fraud, the gatekeepers who protect investors. Yet they signed off on accounts containing forged documents that said billions of euros existed in banks where no such accounts existed. They verified information without actually verifying it. They trusted confirmation letters without confirming them directly with the source. The Wirecard fraud is a case study in how the system can fail. It's also a case study in how lies work, psychologically, sociologically, culturally. Lies work best when they align with what people already believe to be true. People wanted Wirecard to be real. It fit a narrative they believed in. Germany producing a tech giant. A European company competing with American tech companies. A Fintech company disrupting traditional finance. A success story. Because people wanted the story to be true, they unconsciously filtered out evidence that contradicted it. Dan McCrum's reporting was accurate, but it was framed as an attack on the story, so it was rejected. When KPMG couldn't verify the money, rather than seeing that as evidence of fraud, people saw it as evidence of sophisticated accounting, evidence of complexity, evidence of international business practices that were just advanced enough that a consulting firm might not be able to trace them immediately. People believed what they wanted to believe. That's not a flaw in people. That's how human psychology works. We see the world through the lens of what we already believe. We interpret evidence through that lens. We dismiss contradictory evidence as outliers or exceptions. We accept confirming evidence as obviously true. This is the power of narrative. The power of believing in a story so much that you ignore evidence that contradicts it. The power of wanting something to be true so badly that you help make it true by not questioning it, by not verifying it, by trusting when you should have verified. And it's terrifying. Now, if this sounds familiar, it should. Because the Wirecard fraud follows a playbook that we've seen repeated throughout financial history. Again and again and again, Enron did this. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Enron was considered one of the most innovative companies in America, an energy company that was supposedly revolutionizing the industry. They created special purpose vehicles to hide losses. Phantom entities that supposedly had independent value, but were really just tools for accounting manipulation. The structures were complex. They were hard to understand. And that complexity was a feature, not a bug. It allowed executives to hide behind technical language. I didn't understand the vehicles, executives would later claim. I trusted the accountants, I trusted the auditors, I trusted the financial professionals. Same playbook, different century, different company, same basic structure. Create phantom entities. Use them to hide losses or inflate profits. Make the structures complex enough that people stop asking questions. Let people's desire to believe in the story override their skepticism. FTX, the cryptocurrency exchange that collapsed in 2022, operated under a similar principle. Sam Bankman-Fried created an aura of legitimacy. He got endorsements from celebrities. He got funding from major venture capital firms. He advertised during the Super Bowl. Young billionaire, effective altruist, philanthropist, the future of finance. He was at the right parties. He was endorsed by the right people. He was legitimate. So when there were warning signs, they were ignored. Red flags were treated as yellow flags. Obvious fraud indicators were treated as accounting quirks. Unusual, perhaps, but probably fine. Probably just misunderstood. Until suddenly they weren't. Until the lie was too big to maintain. Until the whole thing came crashing down. We see a company in the DAX index. We automatically assume it's been vetted. We see an auditor's signature on financial statements. We automatically assume they've done their job. We see regulatory approval. We can't verify them. We don't have the time or expertise. We have to trust that the system works. And sometimes the system fails catastrophically. What happened after the collapse? The criminal investigations were extensive. They were thorough. Markus Braun was eventually arrested in Munich. He was detained. He went to trial. He testified. He defended himself. He said he was a victim too, that he didn't understand the fraud, that he'd trusted his subordinates to handle the details, that the CFO had misled him, that the COO had hidden things from him. It was a pathetic defense. But it's what powerful people often do when caught. They claim ignorance. They claim they were isolated from the actual crime. They claim they're victims of their own trusting nature. Executives from Enron said the same thing years earlier. I didn't know. I trusted my team. I was lied to. And sometimes those claims were partially true. But the system is designed so that at the very top, you can claim ignorance even when you've benefited enormously from the fraud, even when you've driven the company's strategy, even when you've insisted on the growth targets that forced the fraud to happen. Markus Braun was convicted, sentenced to 8.5 years in prison, which, relatively speaking, is not that long for orchestrating billions of dollars in fraud. For destroying thousands of lives, for losing billions of euros in investor funds, for defrauding auditors and regulators, for orchestrating one of the biggest corporate frauds in modern history. 8.5 years, that's roughly 4 million euros per year in prison time. Not a bad deal, relatively speaking. Jan Marsalek, living somewhere in Moscow with FSB protection, was never tried. He never faced justice in Germany. He remains a fugitive. One of the most wanted men in Germany, hiding in plain sight in Russia, protected by state apparatus. The auditors faced limited consequences. Ernst Young was fined 10 million euros. That's a fine, a penalty, an admission of guilt. But for a firm with billions in revenue, it's essentially a parking ticket. It's the cost of doing business. They were effectively told, don't let this happen again, and allowed to continue business. They continue auditing companies. They continue certifying financial statements. They continue holding the trust of investors. KPMG was questioned. Investigated. They'd, after all, said they couldn't verify the money. They'd been honest about the limitations of their investigation. They'd done their job. And the job of an auditor, apparently, is not necessarily to catch fraud. It's to verify processes, to check that procedures are being followed, to ensure that methodologies are sound. The job is not necessarily to say, this company is committing fraud, even when it is. The regulator that had investigated journalists instead of companies faced serious questions about its competence and priorities. Congressional hearings were held. Investigations were conducted. They shuffle some personnel around. They issue new guidelines. They promise better oversight. But the fundamental incentive structure remains unchanged. The pensioners and retail investors who lost their life savings, they received some compensation through the insolvency process. But it wasn't full recovery. Many people lost 80–90% of their investment. Their retirement was postponed or cancelled. Their plans changed. Their lives were disrupted. Some of them died waiting for the legal process to conclude. Some of them never got to travel, never got to retire, never got to enjoy the fruits of their labor, because they trusted a system that failed them. The people responsible for that disruption faced minimal consequences, criminal sentences that were short relative to the scale of the fraud, regulatory fines that were small relative to the profits from the scheme, civil settlements that didn't fully compensate victims, and in one case, the mastermind living comfortably in Moscow under an assumed name. Not that the fraud happened. Fraud always happens. Fraud is a constant. The question is always whether it's caught. But that the consequences were so asymmetrical, so unjust. The people who were destroyed financially were ordinary people who did nothing wrong. The people who orchestrated the fraud either went to prison for limited sentences, fled to protective foreign governments, or faced fines that represented a tiny fraction of the profits they'd made from the scheme. The system failed to protect ordinary people. And it succeeded in minimizing consequences for powerful people. That's the real scandal. Now, you might be asking, what's the lesson here? How do we prevent this from happening again? How do we ensure that Wirecard doesn't repeat with another company? How do we make sure that the next big fraud is caught before it destroys thousands of lives? The honest answer is, we can't. Not completely. Because the Wirecard fraud exposed something fundamental about how financial systems work. They rely on the assumption that institutions will police themselves. They rely on auditors being competent and independent. They rely on regulators being focused on investor protection rather than political considerations. They rely on corporate executives being honest, or at least not catastrophically dishonest. And they rely on individual humans not being willing to commit massive fraud. Turns out that assumption is sometimes wrong, because there are always people willing to commit fraud, people willing to lie, people willing to sacrifice others for their own ambition, people willing to destroy lives to build a legacy. What we can do is acknowledge the fragility of the system. We can demand more rigorous verification. We can insist that auditors actually call the banks. We can insist that auditors actually verify claims independently, rather than accepting third-party confirmations. We can push for regulators to prioritize investigating companies over investigating journalists. We can make it harder for the lies to work. We can require that auditors not just check that procedures are being followed, but that they make independent verification of major claims. We can require that auditors speak directly to banks. We can require that regulators investigate fraud more vigorously than they investigate journalists. We can create legal protections for whistleblowers. We can create financial incentives for whistleblowing. But none of these changes are guaranteed, because the fundamental problem isn't procedural. It's human. People want narratives to be true. Companies want to grow. Employees want job security. Investors want returns. Auditors want to keep their clients happy. Regulators want to avoid scandal. Executives want legacies. All of these incentives push in the direction of not looking too closely at things that might disturb the comfortable story. Wirecard destroyed that story. And in destroying it, it revealed something uncomfortable. The system that's supposed to protect us from fraud sometimes enables it. Unwittingly, perhaps, but enabled nonetheless. Think about that for a moment. You probably have money invested somewhere, a retirement account, a 401k, a mutual fund, an ETF, a brokerage account. It's held in the name of a company. That company is supposedly regulated, supposedly audited, supposedly legitimate. And you're told you can trust that system, that the professionals are watching, that the gatekeepers are doing their job. And most of the time they are. Most companies don't commit fraud. Most auditors do their job well. Most regulators do protect investors. The system works most of the time, but sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't, the consequences can be devastating. Wirecard was all of those things. A regulated company, an audited company, a company with official approval, and it was a complete fabrication. The question for you, the viewer, is this. Does knowing that change how you think about financial trust? Does it change how you approach your own investments? Should it? These are not rhetorical questions. Because the answer to these questions determines whether the Wirecard scandal is just a story about a specific fraud, or whether it's a wake-up call about the fundamental fragility of financial systems. Whether it's just about one bad company, or whether it's about the system that enabled it. The truth is probably uncomfortable. The truth is probably that you don't have good ways to verify most of what you invest in. You have to trust. You have to believe that the system will work. And most of the time, it will. But sometimes it won't. And when it doesn't, you might lose everything. That's not a reason to avoid investing. It's not a reason to put all your money under your mattress. It's not a reason to withdraw from the financial system entirely. But it's a reason to be aware of the risk. To understand that no amount of regulation or auditing can eliminate the possibility of fraud. To recognize that systems are fragile, and to hedge accordingly. It's a reason to not put all your eggs in one basket. It's a reason to be skeptical of companies that seem too good to be true. It's a reason to ask questions, to do your own research, to not just trust that because something is in the DAX, it must be safe. Subscribe to this channel if you want to understand the hidden structures that govern our world. If you want to know the stories behind the headlines. If you want to understand not just what happened, but why it happened and what it means for you. Because financial scandals like Wirecard aren't just stories about greed. They're stories about how power works, how trust works, how systems fail, how ordinary people get destroyed by powerful people, how the consequences are asymmetrical, how justice fails. In the comments below, tell me, would you have invested in Wirecard if you'd known then what you know now? Or would the red flags have stopped you? And, more importantly, how do you verify the legitimacy of companies you invest in today? The answers might reveal something uncomfortable about how much we actually understand our own financial lives, how much we actually verify versus how much we just trust. Let me know what you think, and subscribe for the next story.